There was a moment in the early years of the Second World War when Adolf Hitler, standing amid the swirl of maps, telegraphs, and reports, could still believe that the world might bend to his will. In those months following the swift conquest of France in 1940, he allowed himself to envision a Europe entirely under German control, a continent reshaped by his ideology and enforced through military might. Yet, even as he plotted new campaigns, the foundations of his empire were quietly showing fractures, cracks that would widen into chasms as the war progressed. To understand the day, or rather, the long sequence of days, when Hitler first confronted the inevitability of defeat, one must begin here, in the cautious optimism that preceded the vast, grinding catastrophe. It was a period of triumph on the surface, but beneath the victories lay a growing complexity of logistics, strategy, and political constraint that even the most rigid ideology could not fully accommodate. In the spring of 1940, Germany had displayed a military efficiency that astounded the world. The invasion of Poland the previous year had been swift, brutal, and decisive, and the campaign against France seemed at first to confirm the genius of German planning and execution. Armies moved faster than any had expected, mechanized units bypassed entrenched defenses, and air support coordinated with a ground advance in a manner that seemed almost prophetic. For Hitler, these victories were not merely tactical but vindications of a worldview. Nations succeeded because they acted decisively, without hesitation, and with unflinching belief in their purpose. Yet as the German military machine swept westward, there were subtle indications that these triumphs were exacting a toll. Supply lines were stretched over hundreds of miles. Communication between units became increasingly fragile. The speed of advance often outran the ability of the army to consolidate gains, leaving pockets of vulnerability that could have been exploited by a patient adversary. These early campaigns were remarkable in their success, but they were also a prelude to strategic overreach that would later define Hitler's decline. Even as he celebrated victories, Hitler's worldview began to impose constraints on military planning that would later prove disastrous. He insisted that ideological objectives, control of territory, destruction of perceived enemies, and the imposition of a racial hierarchy guide operational decisions. This often meant that generals were forced to commit troops to locations that lacked clear strategic value, or to hold positions beyond practical sustainability. The concept of risk was subordinated to the illusion of inevitability. Retreat, delay, or compromise were seen as moral failures, as if the purity of what could substitute for logistical reality. In this framework, mistakes were less a matter of misjudgment than a reflection of insufficient determination, either on the part of subordinates or of history itself. In practice, this created a tension between military pragmatism and ideological imperatives, a tension that would expand until it became unsustainable. By the summer of 1941, Hitler's ambitions extended to the vast expanse of the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the East, was not simply a military endeavor. It was a political, ideological, and economic gamble. Hitler expected the Soviet state to collapse under the weight of a rapid offensive, convinced that Bolshevik governance was inherently weak and that the population would not resist. This assumption underestimated both the scale and resilience of Soviet society, as well as the capacity of its military to adapt to catastrophe. The German army advanced at breathtaking speed, encircling entire formations and occupying vast swathes of territory. But even as these victories accumulated, the cracks became evident. Supply chains lagged dangerously behind the forward units. Harsh weather and inadequate equipment slowed movement. Local populations resisted occupation in ways both overt and covert. And behind the front lines, the enormity of the territory demanded resources that Germany simply did not possess. Yet, Hitler remained confident. Even as winter approached and German forces stalled outside Moscow, he interpreted the slowdown not as a strategic failure, but as a temporary inconvenience, a test of endurance rather than evidence of limitation. He dismissed reports from generals urging caution or withdrawal, instead taking direct control of operations, issuing orders based on an idealized understanding of speed and morale rather than the realities on the ground. To Hitler, surrendering initiative or conceding ground was a betrayal of destiny, a recognition that would have been incompatible with the narrative he had constructed for himself and for the nation. This insistence on control had immediate consequences. Armies were encircled, casualties mounted, and the opportunity for a flexible response was lost. Yet, paradoxically, it also delayed any personal acknowledgement of defeat, as the act of command allowed Hitler to believe he was still capable of shaping outcomes through sheer will. During this period, the contrast between perception and reality was stark. On the surface, Germany appeared unassailable, a military juggernaut reshaping Europe with remarkable efficiency. Behind the headlines, reports described logistical strain, fuel shortages, and the staggering human cost of relentless offensives. Hitler filtered these realities through his worldview, prioritizing ideology and optimism over sober assessment. He still spoke of ultimate victory, even as the operational capacity of his armies began to falter. The seeds of eventual defeat were present, but they remained invisible to him, obscured by a combination of early success, ideological certainty, and psychological denial. It is within this tension between what was happening on the ground and what Hitler allowed himself to see that the slow, inevitable path toward recognition of loss begins to take shape. As the winter of 1941 set in, the German advance into the Soviet Union encountered both the physical and strategic limits of its ambition. Roads became quagmires of mud, then ice. Tanks and trucks broke down in numbers the army had not anticipated. Supply lines, already overextended across hundreds of miles, struggled to deliver food, ammunition, and medical aid to the front. Soldiers endured frostbite, exhaustion, and hunger. Reports from field commanders reached Berlin with increasing urgency, describing a situation that no longer resembled the smooth campaigns of Poland or France. Yet Hitler interpreted these communications not as warnings, but as challenges to his authority. He insisted that Moscow must be taken, that the offensive could not pause, that withdrawal was morally and strategically unacceptable. His ideological lens obscured reality, allowing him to treat the very evidence of logistical collapse as temporary inconvenience, as a test of determination rather than as proof of overreach. By the spring of 1942, the situation had hardened into a pattern. Germany remained on the offensive in the south, targeting Ukraine and the Caucasus, with the explicit objective of securing oil and grain. The campaign in the north, aimed toward Leningrad, remained under siege but unresolved, stretching German forces thin across multiple sectors. Hitler's decisions were increasingly dictated by symbolism as much as by strategy. The city of Stalingrad, for instance, became an object of fixation not for its military significance alone, but because of its name, its symbolic position on the Volga, and the ideological weight Hitler attached to capturing it. To him, abandoning the city would have signaled weakness, an admission that determination alone could be defeated by circumstance. Commanders on the ground, recognizing the impracticality of holding every position along a vast front, frequently clashed with this imperative. Their appeals for operational flexibility were ignored or dismissed. In effect, Hitler was narrowing the range of options available to Germany while simultaneously amplifying the risks of decisive failure. Meanwhile, the Allies were reorganizing their own strategies. In North Africa, American and British forces, having learned from early setbacks, began to coordinate their operations more effectively. Supply lines were improved, intelligence sharing increased, and material resources expanded. Hitler, focused on the Eastern Theater, paid little attention to the cumulative pressures mounting elsewhere. The industrial and technological power of the United States, which he had presumed would take years to become decisive, was already beginning to shift the balance. Factories in the Midwest were producing planes, tanks, and trucks at a rate Germany could not match. British advances in intelligence and signals decryption provided a clearer picture of German plans and vulnerabilities, yet these were filtered through Hitler's belief in secrecy, surprise, and the incompetence of his enemies. For him, reality was malleable if interpreted through the lens of will and destiny. The German offensive in the summer of 1942, stretching from southern Russia toward the Caucasus and Stalingrad, was remarkable in its initial success. Millions of men and thousands of vehicles pushed forward, capturing territory and overwhelming local Soviet units. Yet the logistical strain, already immense, began to compound daily. Fuel consumption outpaced supply. Vehicles required maintenance that could not be performed in the field. And the distances involved meant that any delay could cascade into catastrophic gaps in the front. Hitler, perceiving only the surface momentum, pressed forward with orders that required units to advance beyond their sustainable capacity. Encirclement and attrition became increasingly likely, but his ideological certainty, his conviction that perseverance and audacity could substitute for material limitation, remained unshaken. His generals warned repeatedly, but Hitler's faith in decisive action rendered them unable to convince him that the campaign had entered a zone of irreversible danger. Stalingrad, by late 1942, had become the focal point of this tension between ideology, ambition, and reality. The city's defense was stubborn and tenacious. Soviet forces were willing to endure tremendous losses to hold the Volga and prevent German access to the Caucasus. Hitler insisted that his armies hold at all costs, forbidding retreat or strategic withdrawal, while promising resupply by air and reinforcement from elsewhere along the front. Neither could be delivered in practice. The German Sixth Army became trapped in a gradually tightening encirclement, facing shortages of food, ammunition, and medical care. Reports describing the deteriorating situation reached Berlin daily. Hitler, initially in disbelief, oscillated between anger, denial, and a fantasy that a sudden relief force could turn the tide. This is the moment when the earliest seeds of recognition began to emerge, not as a clear acknowledgement of defeat, but as a growing awareness that control was slipping and outcomes were no longer fully manipulable by will alone. In these months, Hitler's personal behavior also shifted, revealing the psychological pressure exerted by cumulative setbacks. Meetings with generals became longer, more fractious, and increasingly dominated by repetition. Hitler's distrust of his commanders grew. He interpreted caution as disloyalty and dissent as conspiracy. Yet, even as paranoia intensified, he began to confront, privately and in fragments, the scale of the challenge before him. He would later describe Stalingrad not merely as a military failure, but as a symbolic trial, one that illustrated the limits of German endurance. For the first time, there was a faint recognition that strategy, logistics, and enemy resilience might impose constraints even Israel could not overcome. Still, this realization was fragmented, refracted through ideology and denial. Victory remained the ultimate goal, even as a pathway to achieving it narrowed precipitously. The winter of 1942 to 1943 transformed Stalingrad from a military objective into a crucible that tested not only the German army, but Hitler's perception of his own control over the war. By late November, Soviet forces launched a massive counteroffensive, encircling the Sixth Army and cutting off its supply lines. Trapped in a hostile urban environment, with freezing temperatures and dwindling provisions, the soldiers faced conditions that were both physically brutal and strategically hopeless. For Hitler, the encirclement represented a profound challenge to his assumptions. He had long believed that determination, leadership, and the apparent momentum of German forces could overcome any obstacle. Now, confronted with the collapse of a large, well-equipped army, he was forced to confront the consequences of overreach, inflexibility, and the limitations of his logistical network. Hitler's response was characteristic of his mindset throughout the war. Publicly, he maintained a tone of confidence, issuing orders to hold Stalingrad at all costs and promising resupply by air. Privately, however, he began to experience frustration and doubt. Reports from the front described soldiers suffering from starvation, frostbite, and exhaustion. Entire units were immobilized by cold or the lack of fuel. His generals implored him to authorize a withdrawal or a breakout, warning that continued insistence on holding the city would result in complete destruction. Hitler rejected these appeals. To concede Stalingrad, in his view, would have signaled weakness, both to the German people and to the world, undermining the ideological framework through which he interpreted military success. Yet beneath this ideological posture, a psychological shift was taking place. For the first time, Hitler faced a situation in which his will alone could not dictate outcomes. The months surrounding Stalingrad were also marked by increasing tension between Hitler and his military commanders. Figures such as Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, commanding the encircled Sixth Army, were caught in a paradox. They were responsible for implementing orders they knew to be unsustainable, while their reports only deepened Hitler's insistence that holding ground was paramount. The Führer's refusal to allow tactical flexibility, combined with the immobility imposed by encirclement, meant that losses mounted daily and the possibility of salvation diminished. Hitler's strategic confidence, once bolstered by rapid victories and ideological certainty, began to be tempered by the stark reality of failure on the ground. The idea that German forces could still achieve a decisive triumph in the East became increasingly tenuous, even if he could not admit it outright. The human dimension of Stalingrad also played a critical role in shaping Hitler's emerging awareness of the war's trajectory. Soldiers endured conditions that strained endurance to its limits. Food shortages forced extreme rationing. Exposure to the harsh Russian winter caused frostbite and death, and urban combat resulted in relentless attrition. Letters sent home described fear, fatigue, and longing for survival rather than triumph. Hitler's own ideological commitment to perseverance meant that he could not simply withdraw or negotiate. Yet reports of suffering, inefficiency, and immobility could not be ignored. The disconnect between ideology and reality became increasingly visible, and this gap would inform his thinking for the remainder of the war. For the first time, he confronted a scenario in which German persistence alone might not be enough to dictate outcomes. The surrender of the Sixth Army in February 1943 was a defining moment. Over 90,000 men were captured, the vast majority of them facing harsh imprisonment in Soviet territory. Equipment and vehicles were destroyed or seized. For Hitler, the psychological impact of this loss was profound, even if he continued to frame it publicly as a temporary setback. Internally, he expressed anger, frustration, and disbelief. The failure contradicted his long-standing belief in the power of decisive leadership, ideological resolve, and meticulous planning to overcome even the most daunting obstacles. Stalingrad demonstrated that the German army was vulnerable, that overextension and miscalculation carried real consequences, and that the war's momentum was no longer entirely under his control. Despite the shock, Hitler did not immediately abandon hopes of victory. He doubled down on ideological and symbolic objectives, seeking to maintain control of southern Russia and continue offensives wherever possible. At the same time, his decision-making became more rigid and centralized. He increasingly disregarded professional military advice, micromanaging operations with detailed orders that often ignored logistical constraints. Paradoxically, this behavior both reflected and obscured his emerging understanding. He knew at some level that Germany faced limitations, yet his belief in personal authority and destiny prevented him from translating that understanding into pragmatic retreat or negotiation. Reality was encroaching, but only incrementally and in fragments. The period following Stalingrad also highlighted the growing disconnect between Hitler's perception and the strategic realities of the war. In North Africa, Allied forces under Montgomery and later Eisenhower were steadily advancing, while in the Atlantic, supply lines were increasingly vulnerable to interdiction. Germany's industrial capacity, though remarkable, faced constant pressure from Allied bombing campaigns that disrupted production and transportation. Fuel shortages and attrition of trained personnel increasingly hampered the ability to conduct sustained operations. Hitler, focused on symbolic victories and ideological objectives, struggled to reconcile these constraints with his expectation that Germany could still achieve strategic success. In essence, the events of Stalingrad forced him into a new mode of thinking, one in which absolute control was no longer possible, and outcomes were influenced by forces beyond his immediate command. By mid-1943, the first seeds of reluctant recognition had taken root. Hitler's language shifted in private conversations. His emphasis moved from triumph to endurance, from expansion to preservation. He spoke increasingly of survival, of delaying enemy advances, and of exploiting potential fractures among the Allies. Publicly, he maintained the rhetoric of victory, but internally, he confronted the growing reality that the war's trajectory was no longer determined by his will alone. Stalingrad had not yet convinced him that ultimate defeat was inevitable, but had cracked the veneer of invincibility. And for the first time, the cumulative weight of setbacks, logistics, and human limitations began to shape his awareness. The recognition was incomplete, fragmented, and filtered through ideology, but it marked the beginning of a long, gradual acknowledgement that Germany's war effort was moving toward an outcome it could no longer fully control. The summer of 1943 marked a critical juncture in Hitler's confrontation with the realities of the war, a period in which the limitations of German strategy became undeniable even as he clung to the hope of ultimate triumph. The Battle of Kursk, fought in July, was intended to restore initiative on the Eastern Front after the staggering loss at Stalingrad. Hitler believed that a concentrated offensive could break Soviet lines, encircle substantial forces, and restore momentum to Germany's faltering eastern campaigns. The preparations were massive. Thousands of tanks, artillery, and aircraft were deployed, and meticulous plans dictated the timing and coordination of attacks across multiple sectors. Yet even as the offensive was launched, fundamental constraints, terrain, defensive preparation, and the depth of Soviet resilience posed immediate and significant challenges. Hitler's confidence in decisive breakthrough faced its first major test against an enemy that had adapted to Germany's style of warfare, learned from previous defeats, and possessed the capacity to absorb attrition while replenishing losses. The Germans attacked with remarkable intensity, yet Soviet defensive works, deeply fortified with trenches, mines, and anti-tank obstacles, blunted the offensive. The fighting, though characterized by localized success, did not yield the decisive encirclements Hitler had anticipated. Losses mounted, both in men and equipment, and progress slowed to a crawl. Field reports, which once had reinforced his belief in the inevitability of German victory, now presented a picture of grinding attrition that no amount of willpower could overcome. In the months leading up to Kursk, Hitler had already begun to experience a subtle, internal shift. Whereas before he had interpreted obstacles as temporary setbacks, now he was confronted with the cumulative consequences of overextension, resource limits, and the growing capability of the Soviet Union. These forces were no longer incidental. They were structural, systemic, and increasingly irreversible. Even as he issued directives for renewed attacks and held on to the hope of decisive action, the cracks in the German position widened in ways that would shape every subsequent decision. The psychological dimension of Kursk was significant. Hitler had long derived confidence in the notion that the Wehrmacht, if led with boldness and clarity of purpose, could overcome superior numbers or unfavorable conditions. At Kursk, the numerical and material superiority of the Soviets was evident, and the German army could not reproduce the rapid victories of earlier campaigns. The Führer's insistence on controlling operational detail, combined with his expectation that symbolic targets must be achieved regardless of cost, strained commanders and troops alike. Officers accustomed to recommending tactical retreats or adjustments were increasingly sidelined, while units were forced to absorb losses in the service of objectives that had become strategically marginal. Kursk thus became both a military setback and a psychological mirror, reflecting the growing impossibility of Hitler's preferred approach, that human will and ideological determination could override material reality. Meanwhile, the broader strategic context continued to deteriorate. The Allies in the Mediterranean were advancing steadily. Sicily fell in the summer of 1943, and the Italian mainland was increasingly under threat. The German High Command was forced to divert forces from other fronts to stabilize the South, stretching its already overextended reserves. On the Western Front, the build-up for an eventual cross-channel invasion by the Americans and British was underway, with logistical preparations, intelligence coordination, and amphibious training creating pressure that Hitler could neither ignore nor fully counter. In addition, Allied air campaigns intensified, striking industrial centers, transportation networks, and fuel production facilities. German cities suffered both material destruction and civilian demoralization, further compounding the strain on military and political structures. By mid-1943, Hitler faced a convergence of strategic pressures. The East was contested, the South threatened, and the West preparing for invasion. Each front exerted its own demands, creating a situation in which no single initiative could reverse the trajectory of the war. Hitler's personal reaction to these pressures reveals the complexity of his emerging recognition of defeat. He did not publicly admit failure, nor did he systematically reevaluate the overall war strategy in a way that reflected the true constraints. Instead, his behavior exhibited increasing rigidity and isolation. He centralized command decisions, bypassed professional military advice, and micromanaged operations from distant headquarters, often relying on incomplete or outdated information. At the same time, he oscillated between optimism and frustration, entertaining fantasies of breakthrough even as the reality of attrition, resource scarcity, and strategic overextension grew impossible to ignore. For Hitler, the concept of defeat remained psychologically unpalatable. Yet the events at Kursk, combined with mounting losses across multiple theaters, began to erode his confidence, fragment his assumptions, and confront him with the sobering truth that Germany's strategic position had become precarious in ways that could not be fully rectified by will alone. The human dimension continued to reinforce this growing awareness. Soldiers endured relentless combat, suffering casualties at a pace that outstripped replacement capabilities. Field commanders struggled to maintain cohesion, morale, and logistical support under conditions of constant pressure. Civilians in occupied territories and within Germany faced rationing, displacement, and fear of air raids. Hitler's insistence on holding symbolic objectives often exacerbated these hardships, highlighting the cost of ideological rigidity and the limits of German resources. These human consequences, while filtered through propaganda and official reports, nonetheless signaled to the Führer that the war's direction was no longer entirely under his command and that, for the first time, absolute control might be an illusion rather than a principle. By the end of the summer of 1943, Kursk had clearly marked a transition from a war in which Germany held initiative to one increasingly defined by attrition, defense, and diminishing options. Hitler had not yet fully accepted that ultimate defeat was inevitable, but the cumulative effect of operational setbacks, logistical constraints, and human exhaustion created a new framework of awareness. He began to understand, in a fragmented and psychological sense, that the war would not be won through boldness alone, and that the strategic pressures on Germany were both deepening and converging. The seeds of reluctant recognition, first hinted at after Stalingrad, had grown more tangible. For the first time, Hitler had to confront the possibility that his ideological vision might collide irreversibly with operational reality. The year 1944 opened a new and decisive chapter in the war, one that would bring Hitler face-to-face with the consequences of years of overreach, miscalculation, and attrition. By early spring, the Western Allies had completed the long and meticulous preparations for an invasion of France, an operation of unprecedented scale and complexity. Hitler, informed by intelligence reports and warned by his generals of the inevitability of a cross-channel attack, nevertheless struggled to interpret the signs. He remained convinced that the Allies might strike elsewhere, perhaps in Norway or the Pas-de-Calais, and he insisted on holding the bulk of his armored reserves near locations that were, in reality, unlikely to be the primary point of assault. This strategic misjudgment reflected both his lingering overconfidence in deception tactics and a deepening psychological reluctance to accept that Germany could no longer dictate the tempo or location of decisive operations. Even as the Allies amassed troops, vehicles, and supplies along the southern coast of England, Hitler's decisions were filtered through the prism of past success rather than present reality. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy, initiating Operation Overlord. The scale and precision of the assault overwhelmed the static German defenses, and despite localized counterattacks, the Allies established a firm foothold. The impact of D-Day was immediate, both militarily and psychologically. German commanders at the front communicated a clear understanding of the situation. The invasion was not a raid to be repelled, but the beginning of sustained push into occupied France and toward Germany itself. Hitler, still reluctant to release the full reserves of his armored divisions, hesitated at a critical moment. By the time counteroffensives could be organized, the Allies had consolidated their positions, built supply networks, and expanded their beachheads. This delay, caused in part by Hitler's insistence on personal oversight and his skepticism of field intelligence, highlighted a recurring pattern. The war was slipping from his control, and his ability to shape outcomes through it alone was diminishing. The collapse of the Western Front in the weeks following D-Day intensified the pressure on Hitler and the German command structure. Paris was liberated by August, and German forces were forced into retreat across northern France and Belgium. At the same time, the Soviet Union launched a series of massive offensives in the east, exploiting weaknesses along a front that had been destabilized by the diversion of troops to defend the West. Hitler's forces, already depleted in personnel, equipment, and supplies, found themselves engaged on multiple fronts simultaneously. The coordination and planning required to stabilize these positions exceeded Germany's remaining operational capacity. Strategic reserves were inadequate, mobility was limited, and the industrial base, while resilient, could no longer replace losses at the pace demanded by attrition. These cumulative pressures began to crystallize a clearer, if still unacknowledged, reality. The strategic initiative had definitively passed to the Allies, and Germany was now reacting rather than shaping events. Hitler's response to this encroaching crisis further illuminates the psychological dimensions of his emerging recognition of defeat. He increasingly centralized command decisions, issuing orders directly from the Führer headquarters in obscure locations deep within Germany. Generals were frequently constrained to implement directives they knew were unrealistic or counterproductive, reinforcing a growing disconnect between operational necessity and ideological insistence. Hitler's behavior reflected a duality. He retained a public posture of absolute confidence, while privately grappling with the fragmentation of his authority and the erosion of German capability. The result was a series of tactical decisions that were increasingly reactive and often counterproductive, illustrating both the persistence of ideological rigidity and the creeping acknowledgement that the war's outcome was moving beyond his control. The human consequences of the 1944 campaigns reinforced this emerging awareness. Soldiers on the Western and Eastern fronts faced relentless pressure, exhaustion, and the psychological burden of sustained retreat. Civilians in occupied territories suffered from displacement, violence, and scarcity as the front lines shifted unpredictably. Even within Germany, the civilian population experienced the growing intensity of Allied bombing campaigns, which targeted transportation hubs, industrial facilities, and urban centers. Hitler's insistence on maintaining control and defending symbolic objectives often exacerbated these hardships, revealing the growing disparity between ideological imperatives and operational realities. In private moments, these realities would have confronted Hitler with the limitations of his assumptions, the insufficiency of previous victories to guarantee survival, and the profound scale of the challenge facing his military and political structures. By the late summer of 1944, Germany's position had become increasingly desperate. The front lines were contracting, resources were strained, and the cumulative effects of years of attrition were visible in both material and human terms. Hitler had not yet admitted outright that defeat was inevitable, but his decisions reflected an awareness that flexibility was constrained, that options were narrowing, and that the cumulative weight of strategic setbacks could no longer be reversed by bold action alone. The Allies controlled the initiative in the West, the Soviets pressed from the East, and German capacity for sustained offensive operations had been exhausted. The illusion of invincibility, long sustained by early victories and ideological certainty, was increasingly untenable, leaving Hitler to confront a reality in which his power to dictate outcomes was fundamentally compromised. The autumn of 1940 forebrought Germany to a precarious position, caught between the advancing forces of the Western Allies and the relentless Soviet advance from the East. Hitler, confronted with the reality that Germany's territory was shrinking and that his forces were exhausted, still refused to accept that the war's momentum had irreversibly shifted. Instead, he concentrated on one last hope: regaining the initiative through a bold, concentrated offensive in the West, a gamble that would later become known as the Ardennes Offensive or the Battle of the Bulge. This operation, planned in secret and relying on speed, surprise, and concentrated armored thrusts, reflected the duality of Hitler's thinking at the time, an acute awareness that options were narrowing, coupled with a refusal to acknowledge that Germany might already be beyond strategic recovery. In essence, the Ardennes Offensive was an attempt to reclaim control in a situation where control had already largely been lost. Preparations for the offensive were extensive but constrained by the cumulative effects of years of attrition. Fuel shortages of trained personnel, and depleted armor formations made the operation inherently risky. Logistics, which had long been a limiting factor in the East, now complicated plans in the West as well. Hitler, however, insisted on pursuing the attack, believing that a decisive victory in Belgium and Luxembourg could disrupt the Allied timetable, fracture their cohesion, and buy Germany time to stabilize the Eastern Front. Generals on the ground, aware of the practical limitations of both men and material, frequently clashed with Hitler's directives, urging caution or alternative strategies. These warnings were largely ignored, as the Führer prioritized the symbolic and psychological impact of a sudden, dramatic offensive over the operational realities of sustaining it. The tension between ideological ambition and logistical limitation, a pattern evident since the early campaigns in the Soviet Union, once again dictated German strategy. The offensive, launched in December 1944, initially achieved remarkable tactical surprise. American lines were penetrated in the dense forests of the Ardennes, and German forces advanced several miles, creating pockets of alarm and confusion among Allied units. For a brief period, Hitler may have felt the familiar thrill of initiative, the sense that decisive action could still bend events to his will. Yet, as the days progressed, the operational limitations became painfully clear. Supply lines were overextended. Winter weather hampered both movement and air support, and Allied reinforcements began to stabilize the front. German units, though well-trained and determined, were physically exhausted and technologically outmatched. The initial gains were not sufficient to achieve strategic objectives, and the offensive began to stall under the cumulative weight of logistical, environmental, and operational constraints. Hitler's insistence on holding unrealistic timetables and objectives amplified the strain on his forces, revealing once again the limits of ideology in a war dictated increasingly by material realities. At the same time, the Soviet Union was pressing forward in the East, exploiting the diversion of German forces to counter the Ardennes Offensive. Leningrad had been lifted, Ukraine remained contested, and Soviet offensives pushed into Poland and the Balkans, reclaiming territory lost in earlier campaigns. The scale of the Soviet advance and the speed with which it threatened the German heartland placed additional strain on Hitler's decision-making. Despite repeated reports from generals and field commanders emphasizing the necessity of flexibility and strategic withdrawal, Hitler remained committed to rigid defensive lines and symbolic objectives, reflecting both denial and a psychological need to maintain control. This tension between the irreversible pressures of enemy operations and the illusion of personal authority defined Hitler's strategic posture in late 1944. The human dimension of this period further illuminated the consequences of Germany's position. Soldiers endured severe winter conditions, inadequate supplies, and relentless combat, whether in the Ardennes, along the Eastern Front, or in isolated pockets of resistance elsewhere. Civilians faced ongoing displacement, bombing, and scarcity, compounded by the collapsing transportation and industrial networks. Hitler's insistence on holding symbolic positions, even when strategically unsound, imposed both physical and psychological burdens on troops and civilians alike. The cumulative effect of these pressures, while filtered through propaganda and command reports, were made clear to Hitler, even if only subconsciously, that Germany's capacity for sustained warfare was diminishing rapidly. Victory, once a tangible goal reinforced by early campaigns, was now a theoretical concept, increasingly dependent on circumstances beyond Germany's control. By the end of 1944, the Ardennes Offensive had failed to achieve its strategic objectives. German forces were exhausted, suffering severe losses in men and material, and were forced to withdraw under counterattacks from reinforced Allied units. Hitler's personal control over operations, while extensive, could not overcome the structural disadvantages imposed by attrition, logistical shortfalls, and the coordinated strength of the Allies. The failure of the Ardennes Offensive marked another critical inflection point in Hitler's awareness. It demonstrated that German initiative was no longer decisive and that the strategic balance had definitively shifted against him. The psychological impact was profound, even if he continued to insist publicly that Germany could recover. For the first time, the cumulative evidence, Eastern Front pressure, Western Front collapse, failed offensive operations, and material exhaustion, began to coalesce into a fragmented but unavoidable recognition that the war could no longer be won by German initiative alone. The winter of 1944 to 1945 signaled the final unraveling of Germany's position in Europe, a period in which the cumulative consequences of overextended fronts, exhausted resources, and relentless enemy pressure became undeniable. The Ardennes Offensive had failed. The Western Allies were advancing steadily across the Rhine, and the Soviet Red Army was approaching the Oder River, a mere 50 miles from Berlin. Hitler, increasingly isolated in his underground headquarters, faced a strategic environment in which German forces were outnumbered, outgunned, and progressively encircled. Reports from the front lines, delivered to the high command and field commanders, emphasized both the speed of enemy advances and the inability of German units to mount sustained defensive operations. Yet, even as the evidence mounted, Hitler's behavior reflected the tension between reluctant awareness and ideological conviction. He refused to authorize large-scale withdrawals or redeployments, insisting on defending symbolic positions and imposing his will on decisions that had outgrown personal command. By early 1945, the Western Allies had crossed the Rhine and were advancing into the industrial heart of Germany, while Soviet forces pressed westward through Poland and Silesia. The logistical situation for German forces was catastrophic. Fuel supplies were minimal. Communication lines were frequently disrupted, and equipment shortages prevented effective counteroffensives. Hitler's insistence on holding territory at all costs meant that large formations were either encircled or forced into static defensive positions with inadequate support. Field commanders repeatedly recommended tactical withdrawals to consolidate forces, preserve combat effectiveness, and delay the inevitable. These recommendations were routinely denied. Hitler's reasoning, informed by both ideology and personal psychology, was that surrendering ground, even in the face of overwhelming opposition, would signal weakness and jeopardize the morale of both troops and civilians. In practice, this rigidity ensured that German forces were consumed in a series of localized defeats, accelerating the collapse of the overall defensive system. The human dimension of the final months was stark. Soldiers, many conscripts of limited experience, faced relentless pressure on multiple fronts. Urban combat in cities such as Aachen, Cologne, and Breslau inflicted high casualties and destroyed infrastructure. Civilians were caught between advancing armies, with mass displacement bombing and shortages of food and medicine creating a pervasive atmosphere of fear and uncertainty. Hitler's policies, which emphasized total resistance and the maintenance of ideological objectives, intensified these hardships. Reports of civilian suffering, along with the depletion of trained personnel and the destruction of industrial capacity, provided a constant reminder of the physical and moral limits confronting Germany. These conditions, no longer abstract but immediately visible in reports and battlefield assessments, contributed to a gradual, reluctant recognition in Hitler's mind that the war's outcome could no longer be determined by strategy alone. In early April 1945, Soviet forces reached the outskirts of Berlin. The city, both the symbolic heart of the Reich and the practical seat of German command, became the focal point of the final confrontation. Hitler retreated into the Führer bunker, a subterranean complex beneath the Reich Chancellery, where he spent his remaining days isolated from direct observation of the battlefield. Here, the psychological dimensions of defeat became increasingly pronounced. Hitler's communications with his generals reflected a mixture of denial, delusional optimism, and fragmented recognition of reality. He ordered counterattacks that could not be executed, demanded defenses in areas already overrun, and clung to symbolic objectives even as the city's perimeter shrank daily. At the same time, private conversations with aides revealed moments of reluctant acknowledgement. He understood that Germany's capacity to resist the combined forces of the Allies and the Soviets was exhausted, that his armies were incapable of holding the territory necessary to secure victory, and that the strategic balance had shifted irreversibly. Within Berlin, the human toll of the final weeks was extreme. Soldiers defended fragmented sectors of the city against a vastly superior Soviet force, while civilians sheltered in basements, tunnels, and cellars, facing bombardment, street fighting, and scarcity of basic necessities. The city's infrastructure collapsed under the combined effects of artillery, air attacks, and deliberate destruction. Hitler's insistence on resistance, in both ideological and operational terms, magnified these hardships. He ordered that streets be defended, bridges destroyed, and positions held, despite the impossibility of sustaining such efforts. The result was predictable. Attrition and chaos compounded, morale plummeted, and the scale of civilian suffering escalated. These conditions, filtered to the limited reports reaching the Führer, reinforced the growing realization that Germany's defeat was imminent and that no command decision could reverse the strategic trajectory of the war. As April progressed, Hitler's recognition of the inevitable became increasingly apparent, though still constrained by psychological denial and ideological commitment. He faced the collapse of both Eastern and Western fronts, the destruction of Germany's military capacity, and the encirclement of Berlin itself. Supplies were insufficient, reinforcements impossible, and the civilian population in the city faced a siege that compounded human suffering daily. The Führer's behavior oscillated between issuing impossible orders, reflecting a persistent desire for control, and acknowledging privately, in fragmented moments, that the Reich was beyond recovery. His strategic imagination, once defined by audacious offensives and operational brilliance, was now reduced to managing symbolic resistance and attempting to preserve personal authority in a situation in which victory was no longer attainable. By mid-April, it had become clear that Berlin was doomed, that German forces could not prevent its occupation, and that the broader strategic position of Germany was irretrievably compromised. Hitler's recognition of defeat was partial and fragmented, expressed in moments of private reflection and selected concessions to reality, yet constrained by ideology and psychological denial. He understood that the war could no longer be won, that his forces were incapable of achieving decisive results, and that the Allied advance was inexorable. The convergence of operational collapse, human suffering, and overwhelming enemy pressure made the inevitability of defeat undeniable, even as Hitler's actions continued to reflect the tension between reluctant acknowledgement and ideological resistance. By late April 1945, Berlin had become the symbolic and operational center of a war that Germany could no longer control. The city was encircled by the Red Army, and the Western Allies were advancing steadily from the west, leaving no prospect for relief. Within the Führer bunker, Hitler confronted a reality that his ideology and early confidence had long obscured. Reports from generals and aides detailed the collapse of organized resistance in the city's outer districts, the disintegration of communication lines, and the increasingly desperate situation of both soldiers and civilians. Supplies were minimal, morale was deteriorating, and the once formidable German military machine was fragmented into isolated units, unable to coordinate a meaningful defense. Hitler's decisions during these final days reflected a paradoxical tension. He oscillated between issuing orders for heroic defense and acknowledging, in private moments, that the war's outcome was beyond his control. The recognition of defeat, though incomplete, was unmistakable in the pattern of his actions and the select concessions he allowed. In these final days, the human cost of Hitler's rigidity and ideological insistence became painfully evident. Soldiers, many young conscripts or remnants of shattered divisions, were tasked with defending ruined streets and rubble-strewn buildings against a vastly superior Soviet force. Artillery and sniper fire, combined with constant urban combat, inflicted heavy casualties, while medical supplies and food were scarce. Civilians, caught between artillery bombardments and advancing troops, faced starvation, freezing temperatures, and indiscriminate violence. Sheltering in basements, subway tunnels, and cellars, they endured fear and privation in ways that mirror the broader collapse of German society. Hitler's orders, emphasizing symbolic defense rather than practical withdrawal, intensified suffering and limited options for escape or survival. These conditions were impossible to ignore, even in the insulated environment of the bunker, and they served as a stark, unambiguous reflection of the consequences of the broader strategic failure. By April 20th, Hitler's personal situation became increasingly precarious. Soviet forces had breached the outer sectors of Berlin, and German command structures were disintegrating. Communication with field units was sporadic, often inaccurate, and frequently contradictory. Hitler, once the absolute arbiter of operational strategy, found his authority limited by circumstances. Armored divisions could not be moved, supply lines were severed, and local commanders were forced to act independently to preserve what little remained of their forces. Despite the magnitude of the crisis, Hitler maintained a focus on symbolic objectives: the city itself, the ideological heart of the Reich, and the maintenance of personal authority until the final moments. His increasingly isolated decision-making reflected both denial and a reluctant acknowledgement that ultimate victory was unattainable. The juxtaposition of personal command with strategic impotence defined the final weeks of his leadership. As the Red Army pressed deeper into Berlin, Hitler's interactions with his inner circle revealed a mixture of resignation and denial. Generals and aides reported the impossibility of sustained defense, suggesting surrender or negotiation to save lives. Yet Hitler rejected these proposals. In private conversations, he expressed awareness of the collapse of Germany's military position and the inevitability of defeat, yet he framed this recognition within an ideological narrative, emphasizing loyalty, sacrifice, and the preservation of honor over practical considerations. Orders issued during these days were increasingly symbolic, emphasizing defense of specific buildings or districts rather than realistic operational objectives. The cumulative effect of these decisions ensured that resistance continued, even as the outcome had long been determined by forces beyond his control. The pattern of behavior, oscillating between private acknowledgement and public insistence on resistance, underscored the psychological complexity of a leader confronting the collapse of a world he had once believed entirely within his grasp. The fall of Berlin became an inevitability by April 25th. Soviet forces occupied key positions, artillery and infantry penetrated the city's inner districts, and German resistance was limited to isolated pockets. Hitler, aware of the encroaching defeat, faced the psychological reality that his personal authority and operational control were effectively nullified. Yet, he continued to issue orders, delegate responsibilities, and make decisions with an insistence born of both ideology and habit. The human consequences of this persistence were severe. Urban combat claimed thousands of lives, while civilians remained trapped in a city increasingly consumed by destruction. In these conditions, Hitler's recognition of Germany's defeat was filtered through a lens of personal responsibility, ideological commitment, and profound unwillingness to concede authority. He understood the outcome in fragments, yet could not fully integrate that understanding into decisive, pragmatic action. By April 29th, Hitler had begun to prepare for his final act, both operationally and personally. He dictated last political statements, reflected on the collapse of the Third Reich, and communicated symbolic orders to isolated units. The reality of defeat, which had been accumulating since Stalingrad, Kursk, and the Ardennes, had become inescapable. Yet Hitler's approach remained consistent with his earlier patterns, a combination of partial acknowledgement and rigid adherence to symbolic ideals. In the bunker, surrounded by aides, staff, and remnants of loyal officers, he faced the incontrovertible consequences of decisions made over 6 years of war. The encirclement of Berlin, the exhaustion of resources, the fragmentation of forces, and the suffering of civilians all serve as evidence that Germany's fate had shifted irreversibly, and that no command, no order, and no personal authority could alter the course of history. By the final days of April 1945, Berlin was a city under siege in every sense. Soviet forces had encircled the center, their artillery pounding positions previously defended by units that were now fragmented, exhausted, and largely incapable of coordinated resistance. Streets that once bore the regular rhythms of civilian life were reduced to rubble, littered with debris, abandoned equipment, and the detritus of society unraveling under relentless pressure. Within the Führer bunker, Hitler faced a stark confrontation with the reality of Germany's collapse. Intelligence reports, frontline communications, and personal observations all confirmed what he had long hoped to avoid. The military, industrial, and social structures that had once allowed Germany to prosecute a global conflict were no longer operative. The illusion of control, maintained for so long, had been stripped away by the inexorable forces of the Allies and the Red Army. Hitler's inner circle now assumed the dual role of advisor and witness, navigating the delicate boundary between obedience and the practical necessity of acknowledging defeat. Figures such as Joseph Goebbels, Martin Bormann, and Heinrich Himmler confronted the same grim facts. Germany's defensive capabilities were exhausted, civilian casualties were mounting, and the city's defenses were untenable. Even so, Hitler's orders remained tied to symbolic objectives, insisting that certain areas of Berlin be defended to the last man, a command more reflective of ideological commitment than operational necessity. The human consequences were immediate and catastrophic. Young, ill-prepared soldiers were thrown into street fighting, civilians were trapped in basements and shelters, and the logistical networks necessary for sustaining combat had effectively disappeared. Every hour, the city's collapse accelerated, leaving Hitler increasingly isolated and aware that conventional strategies for preserving Germany's military position had ceased to exist. As April 30th approached, Hitler's psychological state reflected the culmination of gradual realization that had begun years earlier with Stalingrad, hardened through Kursk and the Ardennes, and intensified by the Allied advance across Western Europe. His recognition of defeat was now inescapable, yet it remained mediated by ideology, ritual, and personal symbolism. He prepared final political statements, attempting to frame the narrative of the Third Reich in a manner consistent with his worldview, even as the reality on the ground rendered such statements moot. The juxtaposition of ideological clarity and operational impotence exemplified the peculiar tension of these final hours. Hitler understood, with increasing clarity, that Germany's defeat was inevitable, Yet he remained committed to maintaining the appearance of authority, even when it could not influence outcomes. This duality, full awareness constrained by ideological and personal imperatives, defined the psychological landscape of the Führer bunker. The final hours were marked by meticulous preparation for personal closure, both symbolic and practical. Hitler dictated his political testament, addressed the chain of succession, and provided instructions for the fate of those closest to him. These acts were simultaneously attempts to impose order, preserve narrative control, and confront the unavoidable reality of defeat. The conditions in Berlin, both material and human, had reached a state in which no further operational decisions could change the trajectory of events. The city's defenders, depleted and scattered, could not reverse the advance of Soviet forces. Civilians, already suffering from starvation, bombardment, and chaos, had no capacity to influence the outcome. The cumulative effect of strategic overreach, resource depletion, and enemy pressure had left Hitler and the Third Reich with no viable options. Defeat was no longer hypothetical. It was immediate, tangible, and unavoidable. Within the bunker, Hitler's private acknowledgement of defeat was tempered by ritual and ideology. Conversations with close aides revealed fragmented recognition of the strategic reality. Yet these moments were accompanied by continued insistence on symbolic resistance. Orders were issued for final defenses, last-minute sabotage of communications, and the preparation of materials to preserve personal and ideological legacies. The recognition of failure, fully formed and undeniable, was filtered through the imperatives of authority, honor, and ideological consistency. In effect, Hitler had reached a point at which the gap between understanding and action could no longer be reconciled. He comprehended Germany's defeat, but had no practical capacity, or perhaps no willingness, to alter its consequences through operational decisions. By midday on April 30th, the inevitability of Berlin's fall was beyond question. The Soviets were moving into the heart of the city, German resistance had collapsed in most sectors, and the network of command and communication had ceased to function effectively. Hitler, fully aware that the war was lost, acted decisively in personal terms. He ended his life, a final act marking both the literal and symbolic conclusion of the Third Reich. The surrender of Berlin and the cessation of effective German military resistance followed swiftly. Field commanders, previously constrained by the symbolic orders of the Führer, were now left to negotiate survival or surrender, while the civilian population faced the grim consequences of occupation and the devastation of urban warfare. In this final convergence of strategic collapse, operational impossibility, and human suffering, the war that Hitler had once sought to control with certainty and ideological conviction reached its irreversible conclusion. With Hitler's death and fall of Berlin in May 1945, the Third Reich ceased to function as an effective political and military entity. The surrender of German forces across Europe followed in rapid succession, a culmination of strategic collapse, material exhaustion, and operational impossibility that had been building for more than a year. Yet the immediate cessation of hostilities was only the beginning of a far more complex historical reckoning. Germany lay in ruins, both physically and psychologically. Cities were destroyed, infrastructure shattered, and a population that had been subjected to years of total war faced the dual burdens of loss and the moral confrontation with the consequences of Nazi policies. The war, which had once seemed controllable from Hitler's perspective, had moved beyond the capacity of any individual leader to influence. The long arc of strategic failure, beginning with early miscalculations on the Eastern Front and amplified through successive operational disasters, had produced outcomes that were irreversible, leaving the nation to confront the tangible reality of defeat and devastation. The recognition of defeat, which Hitler had confronted only in fragments and through the lens of ideology, became a historical lesson in the cumulative consequences of strategic overreach, inflexible thinking, and the human limitations of leadership. From the early victories in Poland and France to the overextension into the Soviet Union and the desperate, ultimately futile Ardennes Offensive, the trajectory of the war demonstrates how a combination of misjudgment, attrition, and logistical limitations can transform operational success into irreversible collapse. The realization that Germany could no longer win was not instantaneous. It was a product of a series of interconnected failures, each narrowing options, depleting resources, and constraining decision-making. Hitler's personal recognition evolving from denial to reluctant awareness, and finally to fragmented acknowledgement in the Führer bunker, mirrors this process. It illustrates the tension between ideological certainty and operational reality, between the desire for control and the inexorable logic of cumulative military, logistical, and human factors. The human dimension of this final recognition is central to understanding the war's conclusion. Soldiers endured exhaustion, deprivation, and near-constant combat, often in urban environments where the line between combatant and civilian was blurred. Civilians experienced displacement, starvation, and bombardment, frequently trapped in cities that had become battlefields. The moral and psychological weight of these experiences is inseparable from the operational realities. Hitler's insistence on symbolic resistance amplified these hardships, producing a situation in which the recognition of defeat was inseparable from human suffering. The fall of Berlin and the broader collapse of German resistance demonstrates how strategic failure at the top inevitably cascades downward, affecting both military personnel and the civilian population in ways that are immediate, visceral, and profound. These consequences are critical for understanding the full scope of defeat, not simply as a political or military event, but as a human experience shaped by leadership, ideology, and circumstance. The collapse of the Third Reich also reshaped the geopolitical landscape of Europe. With Germany's surrender, the Allies confronted the task of occupation, denazification, and reconstruction. The boundaries of influence were redrawn, with the Soviet Union consolidating control over Eastern Europe and the Western Allies establishing zones in the West. The lessons of Hitler's recognition of defeat extend beyond military strategy. They encompass the importance of flexibility in leadership, the dangers of ideological rigidity, and the consequences of decisions insulated from practical reality. The war's conclusion underscored the ways in which centralized authority, when detached from operational and logistical constraints, can accelerate the path to collapse. It also revealed the critical role of cumulative pressure, coordination, and sustained application of force in determining the outcome of conflict. The interplay between leadership, material capacity, and human endurance shaped not only the course of the war, but the conditions of post-war Europe and the emerging international order. Reflecting on Hitler's personal journey toward the recognition of defeat, one observes a complex interplay of denial, partial acknowledgement, and constrained action. From Stalingrad to the Ardennes, and finally within the confines of the Führer bunker, the pattern of decision-making illustrates both the persistence of ideological conviction and the unavoidable influence of operational realities. Strategic failure did not occur in a single moment, but emerged gradually, crystallizing over years of attrition, misjudgment, and opposition. Hitler's realization, filtered through both psychology and ideology, represents a moment in which personal authority collided with inexorable historical forces. His inability to translate recognition into effective adaptation or mitigation reflects the broader consequences of centralized, inflexible leadership in the context of total war. Ultimately, the story of the day Hitler realized the war was lost is not merely about the final days of dictator. It is a study in the dynamics of strategic collapse, human endurance, and the limitations of power. It underscores the importance of understanding historical events as processes shaped by interconnected decisions, material realities, and human factors. The lessons extend beyond military history, illuminating the consequences of ideological rigidity, overreach, and the divergence between perception and operational reality. In this final reckoning, the fall of Berlin and the death of Hitler marked both the end of a regime and the beginning of a historical reflection on the intricate and often tragic interplay between leadership, human experience, and the inexorable logic of events that no individual, however determined, can fully control.